Welcome to the last Long Island Technologists Meetup of 2024. Thank you all for being here. So many familiar faces. What's up, dude? I didn't see you there all in these videos. So just first question, like while we're doing the presentation, is anybody hungry? You're always hungry.
You took off 4 pizzas last time, just buy it then, that's fine.
Anybody else hungry? We can get like cookies, snacks, whatever. If not, we'll
Wings.
Snacks, man.
Or we could go afterwards. We can go get dinner somewhere or whatever else. Alright, I don't really have a quorum. I can buy you a drink or a beer or a snack or whatever. Alright, so tonight we're going to have a special presentation from Donnie Diamato. Donnie's one of like the original Long Island Technology Meetup members. Thank you for being here, dude. Thank you for bringing your significant others. So good to have both of you. We'll do a maybe 15, 20, 30-minute presentation for tonight. Then we'll just like open it up for networking. As always, everybody can discuss whatever you'd like, whatever topic you want. If anybody else wants to come up and present anything afterwards, that's going to be dope. But I'll give it over to Mike to just give a little 30,000 feet before you get started.
All right, well, Justin kind of did the intro there. Look, Donnie's coming on up. I believe we're doing a presentation on what is a component that we're doing.
That was good.
You know,
This homework.
I thought this was really funny because we met Donnie at VersailConf, and he was like, I don't even like React. And I was like, whoa. So it's a really odd place to meet Donnie and to talk about components. I think it's a really timely talk as a lot of people equate components with React, and I think that it's going to bring a unique perspective to this conversation. So without further ado, Donnie, take it.
Thank you. Hi. Hello. I think I'm going to set up the board with a little bit of something while I'm going to put my contact information so that you can yell at me about all this stuff later. That's right. We're live. We could do it live. So that's me on the internet, Donnie.Diamato.design. That's also my handle on Blue Sky, if you're so cool into being on Blue Sky. And a little bit about me, like Mike mentioned and Justin. I did meet them at SHIP, which was Rispoli's conference in May, I guess it was this year. Yeah, it was probably a little weird for me to be there because I don't use Next.js, and I really don't like also using React either, which is also kind of weird because I'm working with React right now to make my own like playground of a design system, which kind of dovetails into what I do. So I work in design systems. I call myself a design system architect. And I guess in order to get into what we're going to talk about, which is the what is a component thing, I need to tell you a little bit about design systems. Who's heard of design systems, by the way? Okay, hand. Half the room. Fantastic. I'll be catering to the other half for a minute. So the general gist about design systems is when you look at any particular web page that's out there, any particular experience that's out there, when you go from the home page to your login, to your dashboard, to the product page, to a cart, to the checkout, when you do that experience, every single one of those pages should look consistent, right? It should be a cohesive experience. So in order to do that, it's, you would imagine there could be like one person trying to build all those things, and they have their own idea of what that experience is supposed to look like and keep it consistent because it's one person, but that's not realistic. What's more realistic is you'll have teams of people, even teams on individual pages, that would then need to convey what it means to be that particular product at the particular time. So in order for us to keep ourselves consistent, we need to have some sort of system that produces that consistency. And initially that was stuff like style guides. You might have heard of a style guide that has all the colors for a particular brand, all the topography, all that stuff. The design system goes a little bit further into that, because what it does is it not only takes the color and topography, but it also includes things like components, things like patterns. And really what I've been saying a design system is for a long time now is that a design system is actually an agreement. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's the resources that are there, but it's actually the agreement of the entire organization that this is the way that we want to convey ourselves, right? So the organization says that our buttons are orange, they're orange, right? That's what the design system is basically saying. It's the codified version of the agreement of the organization, right? So if the organization says that the buttons should be blue, that shouldn't just be on one page. That should be on all the pages, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a design system. You can think of it like a style guide if you want. if that's something that you're aligned to. But from a more abstract level, we're really talking about the resources that come out of the agreement for the organization. In a visual sense, obviously, because you could have other, agreements that are not, part of the UI, but that's, that could be a separate thing. But yeah, the design system from what I'm working with is going to be this kind of, visual agreement, so to speak. All right. So I would like to assume that most of the room has heard of the word component. If you haven't heard of the word component, raise your hand. Okay, good. So everyone's heard of the word component. Notice that I didn't ask you what a component is, because obviously that's the name of the talk, and that would be too easy, right? Like, oh, I know what a component is, right? Well, if the guy's talk is what is a component, there must be something that he's trying to get to. Oh, the ghost walked in. That's nice. That's cute. So there is. So let's see. Let's do another drawing. Everyone in the room has seen what a button looks like before on like a web page, right? Good. Okay, I'm gonna draw. You with the face. I swear to God, I'm gonna come over there. All right, so.
Are you talking about an actual button or the times when they make a link with the button?
Oh yeah, I like that. I like.
A text word that's not even, you don't even know you have to click on it.
Yep, those could be buttons too, unfortunately. All right, so I have here. I've driven an image or a representation of a button. Okay. So the question I have here is, how many components is this? Right. So what do we think? How many components do you think this is? That's your question. It's completely up to you. One. Totally fine. What do you think?
A button just by itself?
This particular button right here.
I mean, I think a button should be a part of the component, not by itself.
Well, I'm just asking how many. So it's just a number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many components is here?
One.
1. Okay. 3. 1.
You can do it in one.
Do it in 1.
4.
4.
I like the can do it in one, but I'd probably do 3.
3. Okay. Go ahead. Jen's listened to this thing like 3 times already.
I'll say 2.
2.
I can do it in one, but that's customized.
Everybody can freaking do it in 1, right? I mean, shit. So it's not a trick question. I know it sounds like it could be because I'm already kind of trying to cue people up for this stuff. It's not a trick question. Yeah, I'll give you a hook. And it's not a trick question, because as I mentioned about my wife going to these things as well, is that I've done this a couple of times with some different groups, and the results are always like that. Basically, a person, whether they're from design or engineering or whatever, they'll look at this and they'll have a preconceived notion of how many components this is. And it sounds ridiculous because for many people, especially folks that are not in design or engineering, they would look at the button and be like, yeah, that's one button, one component, right? But then there are some of us in here that have built one of these before. And they recognize that, hold on a second, there's more than just one thing here, right? So one of the things that ends up in that kind of mindset is, well, there's an icon here. So that thing's a component, right? And then there's like the label in here, right, which is separate from the icon. So maybe that's a component, right? And then those two things are put into a box, and that box is a component. In fact, did someone say 4 here, or only 3 was the highest? 4. So the 4 I've gotten as well. Do you want to explain your 4?
Icon, logo, the box that it's held in, and the actual button itself.
Right. Exactly. So this box itself, right? This whole thing without this in here, that could be a component, right? You could basically say, I have a empty button and it needs stuff in order to be something, right? And then that something can then be, delivered through stuff, right? You can go ahead and start publishing it or whatever as a cohesive unit. So all that being said, right? 1, 2, 3, or 4. What is a component, right? And I'm going to preface that with something else too, because what we do in design systems as well is that we're trying to also justify our own existences. And the reason why that has to happen is basically because of anybody having a job. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to make a value to the design system. Okay. Now, for me, I think value to the design system is very clear, because if a user goes from page to page to page, and during that flow, they don't hit a speed bump or even imagine that this experience is somehow different from other experiences, because as soon as that happens, look at this, as soon as that happens, right, if you go to a web page and you've been going through this flow and all of a sudden you're on the checkout page and the checkout page looks oddly different from the rest of the experience, you don't really trust you putting in your credit card in there any longer. And that's just the UI looking wrong, right? It's not even saying about anything else that could be going on behind the scenes. That's just strictly the UI that is causing you to mistrust the experience overall, right? So it's really important to make sure that that experience is consistent when we go through the whole thing, right? So that value is very clear for me. But unfortunately, when it comes to folks in the C-suite and elsewhere, they're looking for numbers. They want value through those numbers. So with those values to the numbers, how do we assign our value as numbers in the design system? And one of the ways that we consider doing that is trying to figure out the impact of the system across the organization, right? So what does that mean? That's trying to say, how much of the design system is supporting this particular page, right? Is this particular page completely adhering to the design system, or has this particular team decided, oh, maybe we'll do a little design system and maybe we'll do a little custom things over here because, you know, the design system doesn't support us, or we think we're better, or whatever happens, right? And the organization would like to know, you know, is this page aligned with the design system? Because if it is, then that page is a good page, right? Meanwhile, you have another page that's maybe not so there, and that means that less people are trusting it because it's not close to the design system, so that's not so great. And there's some, again, graph that you could say for every page, it's how much the design system is being supported there. Well, then that comes with the next question. How do you put a number to the support of any particular page, right? How much of the design system is in any one page, right? How do you do that? Well, one of the ways that people think that they're going to do that is by counting the number of components from the design system that's on that page, right? So let's say that that page like has a, you know, a card on it, or product cards or whatever, right? So you have some product cards. They look like this. They got like a title here, description, and like a buy now button or something like that here, right? So maybe that comes from the design system, right? And we can count, okay, they have a product card in here, and in fact, all the cards on their product cards, so that's very well covered. So I can count, okay, there's 6 cards, whatever. But they're also using our buttons in the card. So how do I count that? Does it make sense for me to count 6 buttons and then 6 individual buttons that are inside of those cards? Or do I count the card and not count the button because the button's already inside the card? Or if I put the button in the card but it's a button that's mine, do I not count the card because it's not my button? There's so many questions when it comes to trying to quantify or really qualify if a page is fully covered by a design system. Or even not even fully covered by a design system, because a lot of people in my practice even kind of like are not convinced that something needs to be covered 100% by a design system. And I agree with that, actually. There's going to be parts of it that are not design system related, certainly. You know, you could imagine like the content of that page is going to be very different between that kind of stuff. The images are not going to be design system related stuff. But you would like to get close to that system as much as possible for that consistency. But again, the question that we're trying to battle in the practice right now is, how do we measure the amount of impact that the design system has on any one page? And the only way that we can measure something is with some kind of ruler. That's how you measure something, right? You measure something with a ruler. And if I told you that this was an inch, you wouldn't believe me, right? But this is my inch. This is the way that I define an inch, which is inaccurate, by the way, but this is just for explanation's sake. But this is an inch, you know, but Mike's inch is obviously different than that, right? So if we have different rulers, then how could we possibly be measuring the same kinds of information, right? He's gonna have more inches than I'm gonna be having with this amount of unit, right? So if I put the ruler up to the table and see how long it is. So it's the exact same thing. If everyone has a different definition of what an inch is, or has a different definition of how many components one particular button has, it will be impossible for us to accurately measure any one page. So what I'm saying is that there may or may not be some definition of a component that's out there, something that we could potentially all agree on. And again, I don't say that from I feel a component is. I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for the possibility of looking at any particular UI element and being able to clearly define, because of its properties, its qualities, and so on and so forth, how this thing is a component or is not a component, right? And I'm not necessarily sure what that is right now, because admittedly, the title of my talk is a big question mark. I don't have an answer for it right now. And admittedly, I was going to actually dive into it very legitimately this year as a topic of me researching, but I got distracted by writing a book. So maybe, hopefully in the future, I'll get back onto it. But this is an open question that I'm really interested in. And the answers that I'm looking for do not revolve around feeling, which is the hardest thing about this whole kind of exercise, right? Because as soon as you involve feeling, you involve ego and bias. And I'm trying to remove all of that in the definition of this thing, because when we're talking about an inch, right, that inch, yeah, there's some bias behind the inch, but what we've done is we've been able to relate that all the way back to essentially the speed of light and how we measure stuff in the physical world. And that speed of light is not changing, at least not in this dimension. So that's something that we can actually all agree on. I'm really looking for that like speed of light, so to speak, that isn't going to change in the definition of how we work with components, such that I can count or qualify any particular page and number of its components and compare it to any other page and the number of its components across any system and across any org. And that way we can even measure the impact of our system that it would be for one page or one org otherwise. Right now, like I said, not possible. So what you might see in the wild is people will just make up numbers. In fact, there are companies that are technically making up numbers because I don't think they're actually able to define it the way that I'm trying to define it. What they end up doing with a company called Omelette does this, and I think Luro as well does this. They claim to be able to give you component analytics. But exactly like I just said, it's impossible to get component analytics unless you have a shared definition of analytics. Now, they could internally have their own definition of what a component is, absolutely, right? But then you're comparing apples to oranges. Because when I look at Home Depot and the number of components it has and the way that they measure theirs, it may not be the same as the way the Best Buy and they measure their components. So it would be really helpful, I think, to see any particular organization and see how they support their design system through this measurement, as opposed to just being like, oh yeah, Home Depot, we have 90% coverage, which isn't accurate. We already know that because they have a different ruler. So I encourage you to think about this, again, in a way that removes the ego, removes the bias in such a way that we can measure. I saw the hand here first.
I have a question. Maybe it's your question too.
I have a question and statement.
Ooh.
Actually, I have two statements.
Well, why don't you go first?
I would recommend the book How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. And in fact, I recommend anyone read that book in this room. I talk about it extensively when I did my software estimation talk years ago. And it's basically just that. And he goes into details on how he is a consultant and he would go to different organizations asking them what they wanted to improve and what they wanted to measure. And he found an interesting use case where two different companies wanted to increase security. And he did not know what that meant.
Yeah.
And what he had to do was sit down with them and define it. And both organizations had very different definitions of what increasing security meant.
Yeah.
One of them was, we want to limit the number of intrusions we get detected in our firewall, kind of thing, or penetrating through and all that. Where another one was like, well, we want to make sure that all of our users use strong passwords. It's two very different things.
Yeah.
You're measuring right there. So in terms of what a component is, there's not going to be a universal definition right there. I think you're going to find that, like I saw it as one component, right? Even though it had an icon and text, I could do it all in CSS with just one little tab right there inside of it and do HTML that way. So, you know, I don't need to do crazy icon stuff inside of it, especially now, right? Where he was talking about 4 different ones right there. When I've consulted in the past and we've done React components, I always suggest people use atomic design, because then this way you can mix and match your different components coming in that way.
I fought with Brad about atomic design just like 2 months ago.
I'm a big proponent for it because as a DevOps engineer, I always tell people, I don't care what program, what framework, what language, what anyone is using right there. I just want consistency. So I will give you buckets that you can choose from. So I think that's kind of where you're going with this, is that you want to give these people who are using these components a bucket. And you can say, you can do whatever you want. This is your bucket right there. You want something else? We're going to have to redesign our style.
Oh, you're absolutely right in that, in terms of like what we do with design system, because you have the resources you could pull from. And the thing that I fight about with Brad is not the concept of atomic design, because atomic design is fundamental to what we do in design systems. Right. What I fight about with him, which I shouldn't say fight.
Probably going, what's an atom, what's an element, what's all that.
That's exactly it, right? Because what ends up happening is you get these people who want to go ahead and define what a molecule and what an organism is, and they look at any one component, like a search component is a really good example, and they'll look at each other and go, and at the end of the day, categorizing that composition, useless.
Does everyone here know what atomic design is, by the way? Does anyone not know what it is? So it's a principle where you start off with your elements and you go up. So you start off with atoms, then you go to elements and molecules and pull all together. So in the example we have in the card up here, there are probably 1, 2, 3 different atoms coming into play. You have the button, which is its own atom. That can also be its own element. So you have the bottom footer part, which could be an atom, and then you have the top part, which I'm assuming is an image in your case, which would be another atom. Then that whole thing together forms what's known as a molecule, and then you can pass in different attributes inside of it to render it out consistently across, and then we'll just magically work as far as anyone who's using any of the content creator doing, and then just plop it right into the screen. Right.
But yeah, the thing that I contest about the whole thing is the categorization of all those pieces.
Well, I'm saying,
right? Because the categorization doesn't matter, but
itself can be an element.
right, you can slice this up in lots of different ways when you're talking about that kind of stuff. But
I would say that if you're doing that, you would take your style guide and then go from there and see the differences between. So like if you're looking at buttons across different use cases, you go, you know what, this button is the same everywhere. It's just an atom. It doesn't need to be an element. That could be something that you can look into. Yeah, in that mindset of atomic design.
Right. And you're right about that, and I think what Mike was coming in with as well is the possibility of that React. There could be a React component that you then deliver as React, but it could also just be a CSS class that creates the button. And in which case, then it still comes to the same question of what is a component if the component is just a CSS style. So it ends up being a little bit clearer to me that it doesn't matter if it's React or CSS. There is something there about this that says this is inherently a component to us. The way that it's implemented, I don't really care, but I do care that it exists as some entity, right? Because it's also true, like when you put on like page styles, right? The body background color, body foreground color, there's no component necessarily for that. You're just applying page styles, right? So, I mean, I guess you could have a reusable page component as well. I mean, that's probably...
Well, that's the organ, right? But yeah. I was thinking less on, because I think we're going in this visual direction. When I said 3, I think about the behavior too.
Yeah, sure.
I saw a button, an icon, and a download button, which has to be different than a button I'm going to put in the form.
Yeah.
Because that one may have a loading state. So I may click it may trigger an alert when the download is successful.
Or the download turns into a spinner.
Right, so I was picturing this idea that you need a wrapper that has sort of your behavior, and then you have components that are simply look. And that's where I think atomic design fell a little bit, it didn't fall short. I think he was like onto the right thing, it just didn't take off in the community so people don't understand. I always thought of like your atoms as being these idea of like the dumb components. These are just the visual kind of elements. And then as you go up the chain, you're usually wrapping it in a component that has the hook or the behavior you're looking to incorporate. Because, and again, like a button in a card, sometimes this happens, the designer comes in and goes, as a part of the system, when the button is in this context, I want the rounding to be different.
So what
and
you're
then
saying-
you're like, oh, now I have to start having contextual.
So what you're saying is that button, even though when it changes its state, is that still the same component?
Is that the same? Is that
Right.
right? Does the behavior that surrounds it, the context that it's in, starts to alter what that component is?
It's
And that's what-
Schmidt-Vitzius problem. That's all it is.
It gets very difficult.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know if there is no answer. It is a difficult problem. Don't get me wrong. It's obviously very difficult, but I don't know that there is no answer. And that's why I'm trying to explore. He wants in.
I just want to go in a different direction because what you were talking about before is like a way to measure and a way to convey to a brand, to all brands, that like this is the system.
Right.
This is the secret to achieving your metric.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit more about that, and then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, what I think what was talking about earlier is that, especially with the book, right? The book was talking about how this team wants to measure, one way of measuring security. The other team wants to measure the other way of measuring security. And that's a matter of asking the right or / wrong question, right? Because it seems like he ended up doing was he ended up getting to a different question for both of those teams.
It was more about he was looking for the definition, because before you can measure something, you have to define what an inch is.
Right.
In your example. So
Right.
if no one can agree in the organization what that is, you can't count it.
Right.
It's that simple right
But
there.
what he's saying is he wants to find the universal
Speed of light.
universal inch. So
Right.
in my brain, like I'm not like you guys, but in my brain I go to like things like search engine performance, like core web vitals. This is it. Meet this blueprint and you will succeed in search engine.
Well, I can give you an example that I was talking with Mike about very recently. In our organization, we have a terrible client-side SDK that has horrible documentation, whereas the side that we work on, my team works on, we have fantastic documentation. We get cited for that all the time. And every time someone uses this client SDK and their documentation is horrible because it's really just, it's seriously Times New Roman HTML dumps. Like, that's all it is. And when we talk to them like that, we have lost sales because people are like, I don't want to use this thing because it's crap. Whereas on our side, we do it. So we can actually measure that in loss of sales. And that's the measure that we
And they don't follow the design system
Right.
of
And
like
they follow
your
the-
documentation has a
Exactly.
different look and feel. And it is true, as a developer, you open the documentation and sometimes it makes you recoil in disgust. And you're just like, I'm not going to do all this.
I've always loved PHP.NET. You just do PHP.NET / a function, you go right to that page. Have you ever tried looking up like a Python function? It's insane. You have to go through different searches, and then you have to know, what version of Python I'm using. Same with Java as well too.
Yeah, Node.js docs in the same situation.
Node.js.
Node.js docs, have the same problem.
Yeah, awful.
Yeah, they are terrible.
But yeah,
that's
that's
what I'm saying. It's like you get these things, and they're all differently measured right there. So sure, there is some kind of universality.
Because like from my perspective, the majority of the world is on your templatized drag and drop low code scenario. All of those templates are going to have different responses. If a brand chooses the wrong template because they don't know any better, so is there a universal template that guarantees that humans are going to behave across all web properties or types of industries or types of branch tree very well?
No, that's not the answer to that, only because all this stuff is actually just sitting on HTML. That's a structure that can't really change all that much.
But like Tailwind is all the rage right now, but I think that ultimately people get tired of certain designs and you sort of have to because it has a very, even though you can make anything with it, it has a look if you use it out of the box. And I think that you're right, we were all on Bootstrap for a long time. And then just was oh, this is so boring. Everybody's using, I think there's an aspect of that to this too, where that's why there will never be a universal UI. Or it's like victory coffee.
You also have different cultures coming into play as well too. So if you were going to do a site in Japan, right, their text goes vertical, right? In Israel or any of the Arabic countries, all their text goes left to right, not right to left. So even if you do try to figure out what universal design component is, it's not going to matter right there. I was actually just reading an interesting article about why websites in Japan look so different. And it's just because the way that Japanese people are used to reading information and parsing information is very different in the West on how we read it. Was that?
Yeah, I told you about that.
So, like, and CSS is very Western because it just pulls everything to the left. The gravity point is
Yeah,
left.
yeah, but I'm saying is like this title card right here wouldn't work in that culture because this has a very left to right orientation when you're looking at the perspective where you're probably going to want to reverse it on the other side.
There's a lot to unpack in there.
Yeah.
A couple of things on that is that, so like,
Also, my understatement was accessibility.
so thinking about the localization part of it, the internationalization part of it for a second, right? Social media site. You're imagining one right now as soon as I said it, right? You're thinking about a social media site. You can think about any of them. If you remove all of the paint, all the styles, all the stuff that's on there, and you just leave the HTML structure, and then you compare that HTML structure more or less as a wireframe across other social media sites, what do you get? You could basically see the exact same thing over and over and over again because we know what a social media site is supposed to be structurally speaking. Then we just put a paint job on it that says this is Twitter, this is Blue Sky, this is, MySpace, which is technically different, right? But, when we're talking about social media, we're looking at a feed, we're looking at, profile page, we're looking at some images and like and all that other stuff. And that's all stuff that we recognize as this is how I interact with a social media site. So that means that I could just put a paint job, generally speaking, before I get to the internationalization, onto something, right? I could just be like, oh, this is now Home Depot's social media site, right? They could do that because we already know what a social media site looks like. Now, when it comes to internationalization, left to right and right to left actually is well supported in CSS natively at this point. So there really isn't even a lot of thinking that we need to do when it comes to that. There used to be. We used to have to go ahead and flip left and right, which was really annoying. But now there's a whole bunch of CSS that does it for us. So us setting this thing up, depending on the locale, this thing would flip. I don't have to worry about it, right? So it's not something that's really going to change the underlying definition of this being a component or not,
Right.
Okay? So on top of which, when we're talking about the verticality of Japanese, or even more specifically Mongolian, because actually Mongolian ends up being the only modern vertical script that's still used today. When it comes to Japanese, all that usually ends up happening is it ends up being done in an expressive way. It's not done in a executional way, meaning that you probably won't see vertical Japanese in the Home Depot site. You will most likely see horizontal. And people recognize how to do that. So usually what ends up happening is very artistic when they do it vertically. And I don't care about I don't care about artistic sites. All the work that I do is not talking about artistic. It's not having anything to do with the awards or CSS design or anything like those award sites that work like that. I am strictly thinking about products, digital products that are expecting a user experience from A to B, right? So all of that stuff has a very, I guess, specific expectation from our users. Like we're talking about the social media site. We talk about, e-commerce. That has a standard layout of what we're expecting for that most of the time as well. And that's because users are expecting these things to act in a certain way. So all of that being said, with all the considerations that you're explaining in there, all of that really still just funnels down to the same shit over and over and over again with a different paint job. Even in the accessibility, comment on there, it has to be accessible in the same way such that it meets users' expectations. So that's the same thing. We're still getting the same stuff. Fundamentally, what I'm asking, though, is that there's a whole bunch of stuff, right? Some of this stuff is composed of a couple of pieces, right? Whatever pieces those are. Is this piece a component versus is this piece a component? Which, admittedly, I would probably all agree with all of you. The card is a component. The button is a component. But if I'm going to start counting this stuff, then does it make sense for me to count all of the cards and then also count all of the buttons if they're already part of the card? Am I just like bumping up my numbers, quote unquote, right? Does that make sense? I don't feel good about that. But if this is a component and this is a component, then how else am I supposed to count that?
Well, you can't just count volume too, right? You need a denominator. So you need a way to say, out of 100 components, 50 are in the design system.
Perfect.
You just said it, I'm like, But yeah, you have to have the button if you're going to say, if those buttons don't follow the design system, that should ding your score.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly what I'm saying. So how, when I look at this, or when I look at this, what are the qualities that make this a component? And this is not something that we're going to solve here in Flux Coffee. I'm just going to let you know right now.
Maybe.
But maybe, right? The optimism is really good.
I want to make a comment about the e-commerce that you brought up, because I did contract for an e-commerce platform that is no longer around, and it was Magento, so that tells you how long ago this was. And they specifically wanted me to make it where every combination of a product, so if it's a t-shirt, red, large, would show up in the listing. Fine. But when you click on that and go into it, you had to reselect that I wanted a red, large t-shirt.
Oh, that sounds awful.
Yeah, and I'm like, why are you doing this? Amazon invested billions of dollars into making it one-click checkout right there. We're like, no, our users want to do this. And sure enough, users did not want to do that.
Yeah.
So, and that's why I said, you can still, I think it's good to have a general language that we can all agree upon. And we're in that process of discovering it, just like back in the turn of the last century, we were discovering how film language should be represented and done. So getting there is going to be a challenge, but it will be beneficial in the end, because now we're all talking the same page. We can all paraphrase design components the same way as well, too.
Yeah. I'll call in a minute. The thing I'll mention about that is that I'm not going to touch the question of poor user experience of the 10-foot pole, because I see that constantly, and I will be here until Sunday talking about all the bad, poor user experience design decisions that designers do, CEOs do, engineers do. I was just fighting with someone this morning about how their experience was like all ass backwards. I'm like, guys, why are you using tabs here, which is a very like free-formed navigational structure, right? I can go to any tab at any point. But what they were trying to do is they were trying to get a person to create this object. Well, you don't create an object by going to different tabs whenever the fuck you want. You go through a fucking flow. You go through a flow that says, I'm going to do this step first, and this step first, and this step first. So I told him, I said, you don't want tabs, you want a wizard. You want a wizard that goes through the flow, then it gets all the stuff collected, and then you can send it off to your database to go ahead and make the thing. And he's like, oh yeah, that does make a lot more sense. I'm like, yes, it does. Like, just sit down for a second and think instead of just actually fucking building something.
But he was probably like, Donnie, you don't have a wizard component, you have a tab component.
That's
and I got
also accurate. That's also accurate. What do you have, Justin?
So I'm just wondering, in your infinite exploration of AI, what does AI have to say?
Oh God.
Like, I'm sure you've plugged in.
Shall we ask Claude?
I want to ask GPT.
You should all ask because I haven't. You should all ask because I haven't. But here's the. I haven't. No. And the reason I haven't asked is because I feel like you need to have a lot of context to get the right answer. I have the suspicion, and it's a good idea. I mean, who folks that are going to go ask right now.
I know, I'm sure it'll have canned answer, ask it 5 different ways, you get 5 different answers. I don't know.
Well, my wife, just because she knows that we're going to go ahead and talk about this, she started looking up online about the definition of components for different libraries, and every single one of them was super abstract. Oh, it's a thing that you can reuse, visual UI piece, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, yeah, and, right? So like, if you're going to go ahead and ask how many components something is, I mean, I'm sure what'll probably happen in many other cases is like, oh, count the number of, React components that your package is exporting, or count the number of Figma symbols that are, in your library. That's the number of components. It's like, yeah, well, that's an artificial thing that I created. It doesn't necessarily mean that this thing is a component versus this thing being a component.
Well, we just did a migration from AngularJS to Angular 18.
Oh,
and they wanted to know how many components had been migrated. But AngularJS doesn't use components. So we didn't really have it. We could tell you how many we did, but we can't tell you how many there were.
That's awful, isn't it? 0. That's the number they definitely want.
I could give you Claude's definition of a component.
Okay.
Abridged is it's a piece of user interface code that handles its own logic, structure, and styling. And it has some key characteristics: independence and reusability, hierarchy and composition, props and state, and then the benefits of it are easier maintenance through modular code, consistent UI throughout, better testing as components can be tested in isolation, improved development efficiency, and better code organization, which we didn't really talk about, which is your development velocity is very much influenced by the organization of not just the design system and how people build the components. Because I've worked in systems where there were components that were too many, way too, like, oh, we made that button 7 components, and you're like, what? And you got to piece them all together yourself, too configurable. And I've worked in some that were too single file rigid, where it was like a slideshow that was connected to the data and I couldn't put other data in. And so this balance of how to evolve the system affects the users in the sense that they're not going to get new features very often that they may be asking for if this design system kind of sucks to work with.
Well, we talked about it actually a little bit, only because remember when I mentioned about what a design system is? That's an agreement about the organization, right? So the organization actually agreed to make it that way, didn't realize that it was a bad decision. They all agreed though, right?
Well, the UI team agreed, nobody else.
Well, right? Well, the people who were in the room to agree were the people who agreed on it, right? But that's what it was. Some people must have agreed on, you know, those APIs, and if other people didn't, because the entire org didn't actually come in for that agreement, which happens all the time.
I've found designers tend to have a different definition of components in general too.
Absolutely.
Like when they do a component in Figma, they're usually thinking of like a vertical slice across the entire page, and everything that they're usually thinking more of what I would call a section. And then like for developers, they're like the components encapsulate the behavior, but like in a design sense, they're focused on like this whole piece. And that sometimes can become a problem because that brings that contextual problem up, because the developer maybe has 2 cards and they made them one component, but they look slightly different because the designer was thinking, no, this is a component and this is a component. And the developer's like, no, that's a component, that's a component, that's a component, that's a component. These 2 are the same, but they're not, because there was a slight difference of some that was significant, but it wasn't coded that way. And so I think that sometimes people, like, the context can be broader based on how you're looking at it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's even a world when you're talking about it in terms of these 2, you know, a card having 2 different presentations, right, because of one configuration. So any particular person could determine and say, well, the one card that has 2 different configurations, 2 presentations, is it one card or is it 2 because there's 2 different presentations of it?
I would say no. I think the presentation needs to be separate from the component itself. Because you just said, basically you can think about it as an HTML tag with styling. With CSS applied with painting around it right there.
Right.
And when you're talking about responsive design, I'm not changing around my card. I'm not writing in specific code as a developer to say, if I'm on mobile, do these 5 HTML tags. If I'm on desktop, do these 6 HTML tags.
Right.
I'm just saying, title card, put this stuff in there, and then the responsiveness code around it is going to adjust the presentation of how that comes into play. So presentation and functionality should be definitely separate.
That's where some people get messed up too, is like, I love the section with 2 columns, and then there's like a max width on one, but sometimes people put the max width on the card, and then right below it goes full bleed in some way. And now it was like, oh, I didn't. Then you have like a prop, instead of wrapping it in a div and letting the container control the width of the thing inside of it. Sometimes we get lazy and we're like, I'll just introduce a prop. And then you're like, oh, I'll introduce another prop because the header is just a little bit smaller in this one, and I don't feel like configuring it the right way, so I'll pass. And then you end up in this kind of like prop hell of like 2 configurable. And I think that happens a lot too, where you know the package that does this, we've talked about, it's called class names. It's kind of popularized by Vue. I always say if you're using that package and like the object is more than 3 keys deep, you're probably in the midst of an anti-pattern. And I'd argue that three keys deep is even probably almost too many, because I've seen it where it's like there's 8 and there's all these booleans and it's turning on and off all these different classes, and you're from a prop situation, and you're like, this component's doing too much. So that's like my #1 like code smell, I think, is that if that class names package is present and we start to get more than like 3 keys deep, I realize that we're going to start playing whack-a-mole with like this prop and this prop and this prop, and they're all those 2 were supposed to be turned on together. You're not supposed to have one and not the other, and it never works out really right.
So we're talking about the presentation and thinking about, okay, you know, if the presentation piece is just a variation of the single component, right? Is that what's happening here, where we have the card that has an image and a card that doesn't? Are these
both a card?
Right.
So when I'm developing this, I'm going to say the image is my profile picture, the text is my information, the button is the download button.
Yep.
And then the representation is going to change based on whether or not I'm on mobile or I'm on desktop. Because if I'm on mobile, we're not going to want to see the image because all my shit is below the fold then, right? Maybe you want to have them tap and it'll flip around or do something like that. Do something differently right there. But I, as a developer, I'm not doing a condition where I'm saying, if mobile, do mobile card, else do desktop card. I'm just saying, here's the card, here's all the properties for it. I'm going to let the front end code figure out the responsiveness for it and the presentation around it. Because that's kind of what you want, maybe something we want to measure as well too, is that velocity right there. I'm a backend developer and I tell people all the time, I don't care what the thing looks like. I care that when I push that button, it works. I'm functional over form. And Mike can tell you, because we worked on this for a long time, where we had one guy, he was so focused on how far apart two cards were, and in Safari, he would actually hold like a ruler up and be like, oh, nope, they're 2 pixels, they're 2 pixels longer in Safari, but in IE, they're 1 pixel together, and Fire, and we're like, dude, you're gonna delay your launch because of this right here.
I was going to say, you know what everyone will complain about with this card is the 16:9 aspect ratio is going to have the subject kind of position rule of thirds over here. And if we go to a 3:4 in mobile, the head's going to be cut off like this. And now you talk about, I need to switch the image out.
But what I will say as a developer, what I'm going to want to know is what you want that aspect ratio to be. Because when I do the upload function, and then I have to crop that image and web optimize it, I need to know, do I have to do that 16:9? Do I have to do it 4:3? What, you know,
the focal point, right?
Where the focal point is? Do I have to do that thing where like you have to select it right there? Does it have to be a circle right there? Do I have to crop it down to a circle coming into play? So having the design is critical, and I get where you're coming from right there. But we do need to have that ahead of time because there is that tight relationship between it, but it still needs decoupling around it.
I'm going to go into the decoupling situation because the thing is like, at what point, almost like what Mike's saying about this, the class names, at what point is it too much? Because the 3 is very arbitrary, right? And even in fact, it's like 2 is like he was on the teetering edge of that, right? So that's actually kind of, you know, getting onto the topic of like, okay, is this thing a component, or because it hit 2 class names, it's no longer a component? Like, you know, what is the thing that gets it over to go to the edge?
Should have been 2, yeah.
Yeah. Because that's what I'm getting at with here is like, at what point is, you know, if you look at the designer and says, oh, of course, this is a different component than this because this has an image. Like that's an entirely thing that a designer could say, just because they look different because of the composition.
Or you can just say that they are the same thing, they're just in 2 different states.
Right. Yeah, because you have the error states and hover states and dirty states and all that kind of stuff that could happen in there that, you know, some of us would say those are the same components in a different state. Just like this could be a component in a different state, or for a designer, because they need to actually create individual states to show that this is the thing that it looks like, they end up turning into assets that are reusable in their, you know, other people's artboards, and therefore is a component because it is the input in an error state component, right? Because they don't have the idea or the concept of being able to turn it into a state like we do.
Now, when you, sorry, I don't want to take up you had your hand up.
It's just me and him talking now. Everybody can go home.
So now, when you come up with these designs, do you do a Cartesian graph of all these different components as well?
No one does that. I would love to see that, but no one's done that. Yeah.
I've always done that.
Go into deeper about what that means.
So a Cartesian graph, it's basically from Descartes coming into play. It's basically what you're doing is you're building out a page where you're representing every one of your, like, I'll just use buttons for an example right now. You're showing a button, and then you're showing all the available options for your button right there. The different colors, the different states, everything. They can be functional in a way that, like, you can hover over it, you can see the hover change, you can click on it, you can see a click, all that, but they're not doing anything. They're just there so that you can go in and sort of play with it. And this is good for both developers and designers, because now you can go in and say, you know what, I need a button. Here are the choices of buttons you have to work with right here. And the developer can then see the code. The designer can go and say, I want you to use button A, right? Because it's all worked out right here as part of our design schema. It's bigger, it's whatever, you know, it explodes in confetti when you click on it, and that's what we want on the page right there.
Yep.
So you're building out this graph right here so you can see it. So that could be another way that you can help define what your components are, because now you're representing all these different elements into play, and then you're pulling them all together. So you can have your title card show up in a Cartesian graph. You can see the different sizes of it, the different responses. Figma kind of does something like this when you go into it.
Yeah.
What I was
storybook, I'm thinking.
The story. I'm going to talk about storybook in a minute, but the thing is about this graph, and if you're going to see all of the permutations, I'm going to use the word for that. If you see all the permutations in that, we already kind of discussed that hover isn't a component for the button; it's a state for the button, right? It's not changing the behavior. It's just presenting itself in a different way. It's very clear on that, and, unless you like decide you're going to put an icon that slides in on hover or some bullshit like that. But generally speaking, if we're going to have all the permutations as visible, kind of slices in time, not all of those things necessarily are components as much as they are visual representations of all the permutations of the configuration for that button. And in fact, talking about Storybook, one of the things that I did, 6 years ago was, this is just before Figma was going crazy. Basically, what I wanted to do is exactly what you're talking about. I wanted to have, let's call it the button, have that button go through all the permutations of all the props that it had. So I was able to basically figure what that stuff was based on like prop types and shit like that from Storybook, actually, because Storybook needs to have all those controls for the knobs to turn things on and off. So what I would do is I would actually generate stories based on the prop types for any particular component. Those stories would be every single permutation of this component ever. And then what I would do is take it a step further, because I would take a output of that file. Basically, there was this package called HTML Sketch App, and it would be able to run through all the pages of Storybook, turn them into sketch symbols, and then all the designers can import that as a design system library into their artboards, and then reuse actual real production assets in their artboards as opposed to designers recreating them, which I thought was fucking stupid. So I used to do that whole thing. I presented it and accidentally showed it at that presentation to the founder of Storybook in that meeting. He was like, "Oh my God, this is amazing." So since then, there have been other products that do similar things, but Storybook has removed the functionality that creates permutations. Because they went away from the stories of method, and they're going to CSF3 now, which is all static analyzed. I'm like, no. But they have a new way of doing it, which is through indexers. I know I'm going off track, but like, we could talk about it later. There's a lot that's in there that I'm familiar with. But the core of what you're talking about the permutations, I think is really a good lens about the question about number of components, because you would like to think that I should be able to target a Storybook story, get all the permutations of that thing, and then determine out of those permutations, is this a component or not based on the thing that was changed, right? Because again, like I said, hover doesn't feel like a component, but the possibility of a button being in there, that could be something significantly different than a regular button, maybe.
Another way to think about Cartesian graphs is if you go to look at like Twitter Bootstrap page, Tailwinds, Material UI, any of those pages will show you, here's what all our buttons look like, here's what our logos look like, our tags and everything like that. That's a Cartesian graph as well too.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a good place to go, is to look at what all these, because they're the big tech companies. And see,
yeah, they must be doing it right.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you can use it and aggregate it and then find the common themes that they're trying to present across. And then sort of get an idea of, oh, this is what a UI language looks like right here.
Yeah, it's a direction, but I never trust the big tech companies. In fact,
I agree.
yeah, in fact, I actually was fighting with my boss literally this morning because he found something on Adobe Spectrum, which I love Spectrum. I think Spectrum is doing everything right.
Yeah, React, they come up with some good stuff.
They have some really cool stuff, but there was a page in there that's talking about platform scale. And what they're talking about there is that in Spectrum, what they recommend is on mobile devices, elements are scaled 125% larger than they would be on desktop. And I immediately looked at that and I said, why are you doing that?
You can't do that globally. Yeah, that's crazy.
Oh, you can. And you know when we do that? The OS does it itself. You have a zoom function in the accessibility that allows that stuff to. Yeah, just make it. I was fighting with my manager. I'm like, there's no reason for you as a design system or an organization to have this difference between mobile and desktop when single one of your users will make it be as big as you want themselves. Why are you think that you're better than the user that you have? Right? So that's the fight that I was having with it. It was just, no. The React Spectrum, blah blah blah, on this pedestal over here. And I'm like, completely incorrect.
Well,
right?
that's like
and I even showed him too. One second. I even showed him too. I said, my browser that I was browsing in right there, on the page that I was in for like Confluence, is already zoomed 125%. He says, oh, like no one does it, for the entire browser. You can't go for every page like that. I said, no. I went over to GitHub. My GitHub is zoomed in for 200%. So individual tabs are zoomed in at individual parts.
It's actually by the domain, depending on the browser as well too.
Exactly.
When I go back to like Wikipedia, I have it expanded out there.
And my mom's screen is like 500%. Right? Like all of that stuff. Everyone's zoom can be changed differently.
Then
so
how do you feel about accessibility?
Yeah, you can.
That's-
So I'm telling my manager, I'm like, you can't tell me that people aren't zooming their screens, because they absolutely fucking are.
Yes.
Everyone's fucking zooming.
We just ran into this the other day.
So anyway, the fact that Adobe was doing that, I'm like, you're wasting your time. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say the same thing. Accessibility, though, does this thing where like they create another zoom in the web page, and they're like, now you're accessible.
Yeah.
But this is crazy to me, because I go, the phone is already handling accessibility. Like, how much, and it goes back to the cookie warnings too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how much do we, like, what part of this falls on the user of, you need to know how to use some of the things, like the browser, like the cookie, like you can block cookies yourself in your browser. You never needed a banner that said we use cookies. You can simply turn this off on your own. But we've sort of put it back on the tech company, and the same thing, we put this little accessibility thing in with the zoom, and the zoom there works worse because it's just zooming in on your CSS and raising your base font size, as opposed to using the zoom that comes with the browser, which would work better.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this?
I think you make a counter argument that you probably don't want to put that on there, because if you're hosting it to the CDN, what information is accessibility collecting? And that could be considered a HIPAA violation, because your someone with poor eyesight is considered medical information, and they're harvesting it and they're not allowed to.
The entire accessibility community hates overlays. They hate the overlays.
I always go with a reader mode whenever I go on a site.
Yeah.
Which also is a way to get around paywalls, but that's not accurate.
So anyway, we've had a great conversation here. We've certainly diverged quite a bit, but had some really good conversations, I'll say. So hopefully this gets some creative juices flowing about the potentiality of what it means to measure stuff. I'm definitely going to look at the book as an area of research. But yeah, good chat. This is great. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Is anybody hungry?
Feed me, Seymour.
No, truthfully, thank you, Donnie. This was great. Now we kind of do, a little bit of mingling session. So you guys, meet each other. Let's hang out. We can continue the discussion. We can get beer next door, whatever you guys are feeling. Thank you all.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, man.
Good job.
Thank you.
Inspiration for anybody else who wants to do one next time.
Yeah. I'd like to do your software estimates.